Alrighty, so the first thing I want to bring up before we talk about Gulp is Bower. So Bower, as you can see in big bold characters in the screen in front of you, is a package manager for the web. You can think of it as very similar to NPM, but it's sort of optimized for the front end. Now, Bower itself has a lot of differences from NPM, and we can go ahead and take a look at them with a quick example. So I'll go ahead and show you guys how to install Bower and how to get going with it and what you would use it for. So let's come over here. I have an empty project, or an empty folder. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to install Bower, but I'm going to do so globally. I'm going to say npm install bower-g. Now, unlike Gulp, Bower is going to either be installed locally or it's going to be installed globally. It does not do a hybrid approach. It's not going to install globally as a script and then load in the local Bower as such if it exists. So we will install it globally, but it's generally a very stable and very a very straightforward tool that I don't really have any reservations about installing it locally with. So while this installs, what would you use Bower for? Well, you would typically use it to grab front-end web components or packages, such as jQuery or Bootstrap or Font Awesome, or even other things that we've been doing already inside of NPM, such as Lodash. So now that Bower is installed, what I'm going to do is I'm going to just do a really basic quick example. I'm going to say Bower install jQuery. And doing it this way is significantly better than going off onto jQuery's website and grabbing it for your front-end development. But let's go ahead and take a look at what that command did. So let me pull up a file explorer here. And we see that inside this folder, we now have this Bower components directory. It might be easier to look at this inside of code, so I'll pop that up as well. So now we have this Bower components directory, which contains jQuery, which contains the source of jQuery as well as the distribution. And it also has a bower.json file, which is, the bower.json file is actually very similar to the package.json file. There are a lot of parallels between package.json and bower.json. The difference is package.json is for NPM, bower.json is for Bower. But the idea here is that you use Bower to pull down your front-end dependencies. So again, like if you wanted, on the front end, if you wanted to include moment, you would do Bower install moment, or Angular even. So here I'm installing moment and Angular. And it heads off onto GitHub, and it grabs those packages for us, and it dumps it right here into our Bower components. It's very, very handy, very simple, very straightforward. There's not a whole lot to say about it. So I guess I'll move on to some of the options that you can use when using Bower. And then after that, we'll talk about the pros and cons, when you would use it, when you wouldn't, and so on. Again, I'm introducing this so I can easily pull in some front-end dependencies for some of the examples that are going to be coming up later in the series. It's a very, very simple tool. It doesn't take a whole lot of time to understand. Just like NPM init, you can also do Bower init. So if I did Bower init right here, it'll ask me for the name, description, my main file. It'll ask me what type of modules does this package expose. I'm just going to say globals, and keywords, and authors. And the author, in this case, it pulled directly from my Git configuration. The license defaults to MIT, and then homepage I don't care about. And then it says set currently installed components as dependencies, which is the exact behavior that npm init has. So I want to say yes, which yes is the default. Add commonly ignored files to ignore list, why not? And then yes, I do want to mark it as a private package so I don't accidentally push it to any sort of repository. And we'll say yes. And now what we have is a bower.json file, and it works just like the package.json file. So I can go in, and right now I can come in, I can nuke my Bower components directory, come back to the command prompt and say Bower install. And it'll go off and it'll fetch all of those dependencies and stick them back into my Bower components folder. So that's really cool. So again, really, really, really straightforward. Not a whole lot more to say about it as far as the configuration options, unless you're interested in actually writing your own Bower packages and publishing them, which is beyond the scope of what I'm doing here. But most front-end web technologies can be acquired through Bower, React, Angular, so on and so on. There's one important thing here, though. It's very common in applications and in Node applications that your public directory is not going to be located at their project root. So what I'm saying is let's say we have a Node application and we have a bunch of our server-side JavaScript in our project root, but we want to serve our web server off of a public directory. So we would do something like create a new folder and say public. Now, the problem with that is that our server is going to be serving out of this public directory, which is empty, but our Bower components won't be available. So it's a very, some people like to do this. I personally, it gets complicated why I wouldn't do this, and it'll make more sense when we start talking about modules. But for now, for the sake of completeness, I just want to talk about how we can go ahead and change which directory Bower installs into. And you do that by simply creating a .bower rc file. Now, a Bower rc file is going to be a JSON file, and we can specify a directory. And you notice VS Code does have IntelliSense for Bower rc. And in this case, I'm going to say public components. So I changed the directory. Now we can come back here and say Bower install again. And by doing Bower install, it will look in that public components folder, which didn't exist. Notice that none of those things were pulled in, and then bring it in. So now I can delete my Bower components folder entirely. So pretty straightforward. We can even, it's not just for JavaScript, we can Bower install Bootstrap if we wanted to. And by grabbing Bootstrap, not only do we have the JavaScript under the dist folder, we have our CSS, we have our fonts, we have our JavaScript, but we also have the less source code of a Bootstrap, allowing us to pull in this less code into our own less code, which I'll talk about in a coming up video. So anyway, the point is Bower allows us to very easily grab components off the web. Now it's time to talk about whether you should use Bower or not. This entire video series is dedicated to how a modern web development workflow would work, and how we can use things like components and build runners and tasks and watchers and bundlers and optimizers and all that fun stuff. Bower isn't necessarily going to be the best choice for a more complex setup. It is an excellent choice for a simple setup where you just want to pull in some components and you want to include them on script tags right on your index.html file. I mean, if you want to do that, Bower is 100% more preferable to going out to jQuery.org and downloading the latest distribution from there, or Bootstrap, or Angular, or whatever. If you want to install a third-party component and it's on the Bower repository, but you don't want to make a complex setup with module loading and dependencies, then Bower is a great option. But it has a bunch of pitfalls because, well, when I say pitfalls, these decisions were made on purpose because Bower is a very front-end oriented tool, whereas things like NPM are a very back-end oriented tool. So, for example, you'll notice here that that nested dependencies don't exist. All dependencies are rendered flat right onto this components folder, meaning if Angular depended on jQuery 1 and Bootstrap depended on jQuery 2, only one of those two versions of jQuery is going to get installed. So you have that. You don't have a big module dependency graph. You do have dependencies. For example, Bootstrap, I do believe Bootstrap depends on jQuery, and we can open up its package.json. This is the npm file. We can open its bower.json and see that it does depend on jQuery. So we can have dependencies, but the dependencies won't, they'll override each other is basically what I'm saying. It's going to be all flat. And that can become problematic when library A depends on library C, library B depends on library C, but at a different version. So it can become problematic, but you generally don't care for the the front end way of doing things that we've been kind of enforcing in the web development community for the last 10 years, where we have a bunch of script tags on our HTML files that just load in these files. So you'll never have to worry where a particular file is. No matter what version of Angular is installed, AngularJS will always be located under components AngularJS. So if you want to do things simply, go with Bower. If you're looking for something a little bit more powerful, there are other options that we'll talk about in the future. I wanted to introduce Bower because A, it's simple, B, you should know about it, especially if you're working on a simple project, and C, we'll be able to easily pull in some components that we'll work with in later videos without yet having gotten into alternatives. So it's not the end-all be-all, but it's a great tool, is basically what I'm saying. Also, if you're in Visual Studio does have Bower support. I do believe Visual Studio Code does as well, and it does. So I can go ahead and pull in any one of these packages that I want. There's more than that's just listed here. I think this is just sorted by popularity. But yeah, stuff and things. Not a whole lot more to say about it. So I guess we'll see you guys in the next video.